Shalom! Welcome to Rabbi Kaufman's The Whole Megillah. I'm David Kaufman, and I'm joined in the studio by Mark Finkelstein. This is kind of a soft open for our show. We've had a show on this network a few times in the past. We haven't been on the air for a while, and we're just kind of getting our sea legs under us. As you can tell from a little bit from the video, my head keeps fading into the background. But we're going to have a few technical issues here and there today. So we're just going to play it by ear and talk about what's going on in the Middle East. And unfortunately, this evening, Mark, we have some more bad news coming out of Israel.
Well, apparently there have been 4 attacks in Israel today. 13 or so people have been injured from what we could tell.
And one appears to have been a U.S. tourist who died in this evening's attack in Jaffa. Which seems to have been the worst of the attacks today.
Well, I'm not sure any of those are considered worse than others. You were mentioning before we went on the air about a particular victim who took the knife out of his own throat and stabbed his assailant.
The stories just get crazier and crazier as you hear them.
And we hear that these attacks have been lauded by Hamas as well.
Yeah, just unbelievable.
Unbelievable.
So a lot of news coming out of Israel today, and one of the big pieces of news is that the Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu evidently was supposed to be meeting with President Obama, I guess before President Obama went on a South American swing to multiple different countries in South America, including Cuba. And he was supposed to meet with Benjamin Netanyahu in the White House, probably to talk about any number of different things, and Netanyahu chose not to come. And you could say that this is a snub of the president. I think to a certain extent it is. But it sounds to me like from what the office is saying is that they're so concerned about the situation of the American elections.
Yes.
And people potentially getting upset about Netanyahu not coming to pose with them or not talking to them or any number of other things to aid, especially on the Republican side in the presidential elections, that Netanyahu is reluctant to come. He doesn't want to appear with Donald Trump. He doesn't want Donald Trump to end up winning the Republican nomination and appear with one of the other guys.
So this is worse than usual.
It's a mess.
The worse than usual snafu. Now, it's very unclear as to the exact timetable of what happened. I'm sure it's always preferable that the Israeli Prime Minister meet with the President of the United States. And as you say, the complication was the appearance of the presidential candidates, who will each want particularly private time with the Prime Minister of Israel.
Well, yeah, and it's not even just private time. I mean, I think the issue is that they want to appear pro-Israel, and so they want to appear with Benjamin Netanyahu. And I think Netanyahu may be wising up a little bit. I think the issue here is that he doesn't want to be exploited. One of the criticisms of the last time he did this around election time is there was a belief that he came to the United States, appeared with candidates, and that it came across as either him supporting the candidate or being exploited by the candidate, one or the other. And both of those things are definitely problematic.
You know, the other talk in the internet had been about how the GOP is so fractionated these days that what appeared to be the solid GOP in support of Israel is slipping away. Do you agree with that, David?
Well, look, I think that sanity in Washington is slipping away. I mean, as I look at it, it seems like everybody simply wants to to figure out how to get their own voters to cheer them in whatever they're doing, and they're appealing to a base. And a lot of the time, the appeals to the base seem to be done in such a way that the positions are very extremist. And so we're looking at a situation in which you've got people wanting to appear as pro-Israel as they can possibly be, or potentially going to a hostile Israel audience and appearing like they're willing to question the U.S.-Israel relationship or weaken the U.S.-Israel relationship or be even-handed with the U.S.-Israel relationship. And the reality is that's all problematic. Instead of our candidates really advocating for what's in America's best interest, they're out there trying to advocate for what's in their best campaign interest.
Well, according to which position their base takes to begin with.
Yeah, well, but I don't.
And there are different bases.
There certainly are. There certainly are constituencies that are willing to hear
different
arguments
messages
that are in line with America's best interest. I'm not going to say that, but there are many constituencies that want to dispute what's in America's best interest, and the candidates seem to be speaking to those groups whatever they want. They're not telling people, for the most part, no, I don't agree with you, you're wrong. They're telling everybody what they want to hear, and so we're seeing lots of rah-rah rallies rather than candidates coming before crowds and educating them about their positions
based on a policy
and what's going, and even expounding policies. They're just telling them what they want to hear.
Yeah, it's
dangerous.
It's dangerous. Now, at the same time, Joe Biden, I think even today, is making contact with the Middle East. He's supposedly coming.
Well, Biden's going on a trip to Israel at some point too.
Israel and the Palestinian territories and Jordan, from what I could tell.
Well, and so there's so many different issues going on in the region. I mean, I think a significant portion of what's going on is the United States is trying to reassure, particularly Jordan, that with all the pressure coming from Syria and Iraq in the form of ISIS and then refugees coming into the country they're potentially destabilizing, that the United States and Jordan's allies, the rest of Jordan's allies, will have its back. Israel's been certainly doing that too, but the fear from Jordan, I think, is that if the United States acts in Syria, it could worsen the refugee problem and bring more pressure on the Jordanians. The situation with the Israelis and the Palestinians, look, I think when you go to the region, you talk to the Israelis and Palestinians. I think the Israelis certainly are playing a significant security role in the region right now, regardless of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Just dealing with Syria and the situation there, the Israelis are playing a major role. And the United States has to go talk to the Israelis. So, not to mention the fact that the United States is friends with the Israelis, and that's just a good thing to do. So you go to speak with the Palestinians as well. I'm not sure how much of this has to do with the peace process. I think every time the United States goes to the region, the United States stresses the peace process because that's what everybody wants to hear. And there's a certain belief that and I think it's a valid one, that one of the major problems in the region is hopelessness. And if the United States isn't talking about the peace process or prospects of making things better, who's going to? Right? So Biden going to meet with the Israeli leadership and then going to meet with the Palestinian leadership has some function as far as just being able to, for the average person in the street to feel better about what's going on.
For the future.
Now, that said, we had this awful Pew poll today.
Yes.
And, the major headline that comes out of the Pew poll is that virtually half of Israelis are willing to have the Arab population leave the country, either to expel the Arab population, which I think is something that may be part of the kind of an ultra-Orthodox radical point of view, or potentially to have the Arab areas be a part of a Palestinian state instead of being part of an Israel.
Well, that issue had been floated a while ago by Avigdor Lieberman. And the fact of having areas transferred to the Palestinian territory to become part of the Palestinian state, and at the same time reconfer Palestinian nationhood on those individuals, is probably rejected by human rights activists. Because it's the Human Rights Declaration that came out after the end of the Second World War seemed to indicate it's not a valid thing to automatically shift somebody's nationality.
Yeah, and this is a big problem in a number of the places we're talking about in Israel. I mean, especially in Jerusalem, right? Because you're talking about people who are functionally part of Israel right now, who may elect to remain part of Israel. At the end of a deal, well, what happens if the international community suddenly makes the line through East Jerusalem and says, well, you're living in a Palestinian state, you're a Palestinian.
You're a Palestinian.
Right? I mean, so the international community may well end up doing that, at least for Arabs living in Jerusalem.
As opposed to what we were talking about, the Lieberman proposition of taking territory in the lower Galilee that's contiguous to the
West Bank. Like
al-Fahd,
for example. They're talking about making that a Palestinian territory. So that's a problem. Many places in Israel, Jews and Arabs of all stripes get along with no problem at all. And I think among the secular population, the percentage who would be willing or interested in expelling the population or having the population be a part of a Palestinian state, I think is much smaller.
Much more, significantly smaller. Something akin to 80% to 20%.
If you look at the poll that came out, it looks like the Haredi population essentially believes that God gave the land to the Israelis, God gave the land to the Jews, and that essentially that means that the Arabs are invaders, right? They're invaders of the Jews' land. And there's something significantly problematic about that. It's going to impact your policies, and their level of tolerance is, needless to say, fairly low.
But in addition to that, the statistics seem to indicate there were three camps: the far right, the far left, and the center. And even the center camp had a significant predilection for dispersing the Arabs.
Well, and I think your three camps are the right wing. I think would be in favor of expelling the population
those are the Haredis.
And maintaining all the land. Yes. Right, that's your right wing.
Right.
I think your center is looking at this and saying to maintain a Jewish and democratic state, we do not want to absorb large Arab populations in the future Israel, and therefore we need to make sure that those populations are outside of Israel, right? I think there's not enough context in the question.
No, there is no context in the question.
So that the center may believe that that's the purpose of a two-state solution. Ultimately, is to have the Arab populations be part of the Palestinian state and have the Jewish populations part of the Jewish state,
or at least for security purposes,
or at least the sizable populations we're dealing with. And then the left wing, I think, is perfectly willing to work with the Arab population. I think there's definitely a difference in tolerance, and I also think it's where you live. I mean, when I was in Israel recently, just a little over a week ago, it was fairly clear that the situation in Jerusalem is a whole lot different than the situation in Tel Aviv. Right now,
because of the demographics.
Yeah, but I think also there's a lot more fear in Jerusalem than there is in Tel Aviv, and I think that when you're dealing with the center and the right, a lot of those people are Jerusalem and its environs, and the secularists and progressives who dominate the Tel Aviv community are much more tolerant of everybody. They don't feel particularly threatened. And so I think some of that has to do with fear in the current climate. And I think that, things like a stabbing in Jaffa Could certainly
destabilizes
negatively
everything.
impact the Tel Aviv end of that argument also.
Yeah, because it occurs in places where you wouldn't expect that type of violence to have taken place.
Well, I mean, the violence seems to be occurring in places where you have a mixture of Arabs and Jews, and particularly that's Jerusalem. But it could certainly impact a place like Jaffa, where there's a significant number of both. The person who did the stabbing this evening evidently is from Qalqilia, so they're not even from the area. They just came in somehow. But
they came in because Qalqilia is technically part of Israel, and there's no travel restrictions on people who live there, so there's free transport.
So you're still dealing. You're dealing with some problematic situations, and the Palestinian Authority has not done much of anything to discourage this kind of behavior.
That's maybe something that Joe Biden will talk to them about.
Well, I think they have to. Look, it's fairly clear that neither side wants to do what they need to do to actually acquire peace right now, and I don't think either side trusts the other one. I mean, you're looking at a situation on the Palestinian side where right now they're dealing with a government where Netanyahu is the liberal, right? I mean,
which is not perceptible
in this
by
government,
most people,
or almost the liberal. He's not the farthest left in this government,
centrist.
but he's certainly not the farthest right in this government.
Yeah.
And the other side of the Israeli electorate, the liberal parties, don't believe that peace is possible as long as Hamas is running Gaza, and they want to oust Hamas. So everybody in the Israeli population, on the Israeli side, is basically putting pressure on the situation.
As is the potential funding or actual funding coming from Iran.
Well, look, the larger global situation is clearly going to be problematic. The larger regional situation has Islamic State as an enemy, it has Iran as a potential enemy, and it has both of them using proxies in the nations surrounding Israel to potentially attack Israel. And the Palestinian Authority, for that matter. The Palestinian Authority is functionally the enemy of both Iran and the Islamic State. The Palestinian Authority would be allied with the government of Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Jordan. Those are all enemies of the Islamic State and Iran. So how stable could that government be if it's not being protected? Right now, Jordan is being protected by Israel. So how could the Palestinian state not be protected? I mean, if you're going to move to a situation in which the Palestinians gain sovereignty by being protected by Israel, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It makes sense to do some sort of intermittent thing that doesn't change the status quo in a way that you wouldn't want it to change.
At the same time, the Palestinian Authority is so unstable. Besides the fact that there's been no elections there for 10 years, the information that's coming out seems to say that the power is concentrated in the hands of Mahmoud Abbas. That Fatah essentially is Abbas. And until there's more accountability within the Palestinian Authority, people will continue to consider it simply the private purview of whoever's running it at the moment.
So why don't we go ahead and take a break now, and then we'll talk a little bit more about what I think is a fairly significantly problematic Pew poll that came out today, and we'll kind of go through that in some detail.
Credit cards are like grandkids. They love you, sometimes get out of control, and it's fun to get a new one. Who can stop them from piling on?
Hi, I'm Tom Coates with Consumer Credit of Des Moines. At the end of the day, you can return the grandkids, but you're stuck paying off bad credit card debt. We'll help you put the fun back into using credit cards responsibly. Right, kids?
Yeah!
If you need help getting credit cards off your back, call Consumer Credit of Des Moines.
Hi, my name is David Burrier, your Hope Coach. I host a live weekly talk show called I've Been There every Thursday afternoon at 5:30, right here on webcast1live.com, and on my weekly radio program Saturday mornings at 10 on Truth Network 99.3 FM. I interview common everyday people who have survived incredible life challenges and who testify to God's faithfulness in the midst of their storms. So join me as we bring a message of hope and encouragement. Everybody needs hope. I know, because I've been there.
Hey everybody, I brought Northern Lights Pizza! And it's got Graziano sausage!
Rock and Prevention is celebrating 25 years of creating a caring community. We want to say thank you to the tens of thousands of Rock High School mentors that have carried our message of health, love, and encouragement to over 1.5 million children, teachers, and parents. Our mentors teach children methods and skills to prevent bullying and drug use. Thank you to all the school administrators, teachers, and counselors for their opportunity to serve you. Rock on, fair citizens, rock on! This is Pat McManus for Rock and Prevention, the Richard O. Jacobson Foundation, and this station.
From the RE/MAX Real Estate Concept Studios, this is Webcast One Live.
Shalom. Welcome back to the whole Megillah. I'm Rabbi Kaufman. I'm joined in the studio by Mark Finkelstein. I don't know what kind of fuzz is blowing around in the background here, but it kind of looks like there's a whole crowd of mosquitoes to my right. The issue that we were talking about before we went to break was the Pew poll and the consequences of a situation in which you have a significant percentage of the population that in this poll conducted by the Pew organization of Israelis was arguing that Israel should transfer or expel a significant the Arab population, that Israel should be a Jewish state, and that means for Jews. And one of the things that we've been discussing over the last few weeks is this idea of Jewish and democratic Israel, and also bringing in a third dynamic, the land, that you could potentially put the Israeli political parties on a spectrum on these three different issues, looking at how highly they promote the Jewish character of Israel, how highly they promote the democratic character of Israel, and how much they stress the land of Israel. And I'd put in a fourth, as you're dealing with Israel advocates, which is security, because to a certain extent, there's the degradation of security in relation to some of these and not in relation to others. And that centrist parties tend to stress all four of those. They don't want, or at least Judaism, democracy, and security, with a significant portion on the land of Israel, especially if you're talking about Jerusalem.
So why don't you go through each one of the segments and see how they line up?
So if you're dealing with stress on the Jewish character of Israel, as the four of those, the ultra-Orthodox parties for sure stress the Jewish character of Israel, and they stress the Jewish character of Israel over and above everything else.
And their definition of the Jewish character is more religious.
Jewish religious character of Israel. I think the other parties, when you're dealing with kind of the mainstream of Israel, the mainstream of Israel sees Israel as the homeland of the Jewish people, as a significant portion. And yes, there is some stress on the religious portion of that, but very significantly on the ethnic portion of it, right?
The ethic or the culture. the cultural portion of Israel, which most Israelis live, even if they don't have a religious bent to their philosophy.
Yeah, so if you're dealing with pretty much everybody, whether you're dealing with Likud, Zionist Union, Kulanu, or Yesh Atid, any of those kind of in the political center to the center left, you're going to be dealing with Judaism as cultural, and as you move toward the right, a little bit more religious, until you hit the religious parties, in which case it's primarily about Judaism as a religion. They might even double up the Judaism so that it's about Judaism as a religion and as the homeland for the Jewish people. And then when you get to the far left, you start getting to Meretz, where Meretz is less so on the stressing the Jewish aspects of Israel. It is somewhat on the Israel as a Jewish homeland, but much less so, or not at all, on the Jewish religious aspects of that. And then, obviously, the Arab parties, for the most part, see Israel as neither a homeland for the Jewish people nor as a place for the expression of religious Judaism.
With notable exceptions of people who have a working relationship with the Jewish population. I
mean, there are a few, but when you're dealing with the Arab list, you're as an official policy.
Yes.
I mean, the leader of the Arab list the other day said we shouldn't consider Hezbollah to be a terrorist organization. What in the world is that? He condemned the Arab League, and the leadership of Israel said you're a member of the Knesset. Hezbollah, when Hezbollah fires rockets from Lebanon down into Israel, oftentimes they hit Arab villages, and you're going to refuse to declare them a terrorist organization. It almost doesn't make any sense at all. So,
well, it doesn't make any sense, and that's why
they called him out on it.
Yeah, and when you call them out on it, you have basically a parliamentary problem, because you have members of the Israeli parliament who don't believe in the state of Israel.
And so they've talked about at some point in time having some sort of pledge of allegiance to the state of Israel as a requirement. And it's hard to imagine that in the context of the United States, that you would have a situation in which you would have members of the U.S. Congress who don't believe that the United States should exist.
Well,
which is what you've got in Israel.
Well, which is an ideological problem, rather, that is absent in the United States.
It's absent anywhere else, because no other country would tolerate that.
Yeah.
Israel, as far as I know, is the only country in the world that tolerates having people who are making its laws who don't believe that the country should exist, that they're making laws for. And that they're actively supporting the enemies of the country. And
this is not the first time.
This is not the first time. It's nothing new. So anyway, we've looked at the Jewish spectrum. Then you got the Democratic spectrum. And we're talking not about Democrats or Republicans and Democrats. We're talking about democracy. And so the idea here is that when you get to the left wing of the political spectrum, for sure stresses the democratic nature of Israel, democracy, that everybody should have a role. It doesn't matter whether you're a Jew or you're an Arab Muslim or Arab Christian or a Druze. You have a place in the Israeli society. You have a vote. You have rights. If you're a refugee or an asylum seeker in Israel, you have rights that you have to be treated from the democratic process, and to a certain extent that majority should rule, and that individuals should have rights, and that this group tends to argue in favor of Israel getting a constitution and a Bill of Rights that defend individual rights against tyranny of the religious.
That's not going to happen, because the structure of how Israel codified what would have been a constitution.
Well, we heard rumblings that they may eventually get there. Who knows? I mean, Israel is still essentially on a war footing. It still essentially has laws that are designed to accommodate the fact that it's constantly under threat. So the issue that comes up is that the right-wing parties, particularly the religious right-wing parties, would rather stress the Jewish nature of Israel and give elevated rights to Jews. And one of the things that came out in this poll is this idea that a significant percentage of people believe that Jews should receive preferential treatment in Israel. And this is as opposed to other Israeli citizens. This is not as opposed to people who are not citizens of Israel. They would essentially say that there are different levels of citizenship. And, if you're dealing with that, that's a significant problem for those of us who want Israel to be a democracy and who are concerned with how minorities are treated.
We're talking about pluralism as a whole as well.
Well, but you're not only talking about pluralism. You're not only talking about Orthodox versus non-Orthodox relationships. You're also talking about what rights do Arab Israelis have, what rights do Druze Israelis have, can the religious Jewish community in Israel, particularly the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel, make rules that limit the rights of those people, or even act in such a way that acts as if those people don't have any rights?
But this is all also moderated by the High Court.
So the High Court clearly limits this point of view. Now we're talking about oftentimes political parties that are constantly challenging the High Court's decisions or trying to enforce laws to override the High Court's decisions, right? So on the political spectrum in Israel, there is this right wing that we're dealing with, the ultra-Orthodox parties in particular, that try to push through legislation in the Knesset that essentially go against the civil rights
rulings
legislations,
of the High Court.
Rulings of the High Court.
Yeah.
And there are a whole bunch of specific things that we'll get to later on. There's also, we talked about Judaism and democracy in this idea of the land as being one of the things that determines where you are. Now, on a spectrum, it's essentially more where you prioritize the land on the list. The Jewish Home Party believes that all the land should belong to the Jews. That includes all of the West Bank and all of Gaza and all of the regular territory. And
you mean they haven't given up on Gaza at this point?
They haven't even given up on Gaza.
Well,
I mean, there's a little bit of leeway in Gaza. I don't know, but I'm sure they also believe in controlling the Golan, and they may well. I mean, I don't even know if they limit it there. They may well believe that other land should be Jewish that Israel doesn't even control. The issue that comes up for them is that if you're ranking the issues, the far right in Israel would rank the Jewish character of Israel number one. They would rank the land number two, because God gave the land to the Jewish people, according to their view, and how dare we go against God. And then number three would be the democratic character of Israel.
But you also put a fourth factor in there, meaning security.
Now, the fourth factor, I think, is one that's often ignored, and I think it's actually the one that's causing the most problem for the peace process. Because the fourth factor is security, and we're talking about securing Jewish lives here, the Jewish Israeli lives, and really we're talking about securing all of Israeli lives, because an attack like you had tonight, there's no way that the attacker would have had any clue what the religious affiliation was of somebody they attacked. We've had numerous situations in which Israeli Druze soldiers or Israeli Arab Christians have been harmed in attacks, or even Israeli Arab Muslims have been harmed in attacks, and there are numerous cases in which Druze Christian and Druze Arab Christian and Arab Muslim soldiers in the IDF and police have been the ones who have been fighting against the attackers, or been the ones who were attacked. Many of the Israeli border security guards are not Jews. They're people who are Arabic speakers because that's the culture they're from. Yeah. So anyway, the issue of security actually is more broad, and it really impacts everywhere from the center all the way across, really from pretty far on the left all the way across to the far right. Now, there's some question as some of the political parties would say Jewish character, land, and security is actually pretty far down because they'd rather be fighting a war against an occupied, dangerous population rather than make peace with them. That was a point that was made, that security is actually lower because instead of being willing to work with the Palestinians and create a Palestinian state living alongside Israel in peace, which would be the epitome of a secure solution that removes hostile population from your midst and allows them to live in peace and security on their own and not attack you, this population would rather maintain all of the land at the expense of that security. So you have different layers here, but the center of the Israeli electorate, I think, would want to maintain the major settlement blocks, the major portion of Israel as we know it, and then along with that, the major Jerusalem, at least the heart of Jerusalem.
Because the statistics seem to show that even people centered towards the left now value the settlements for security reasons.
Well, and so this gets to be really dangerous situation, right? Because how big does the buffer have to be? I mean, you can make the argument, if you go to Jerusalem right now and you look at East Jerusalem, and I went on Danny Seidman's tour of Jerusalem for Ir Amin, right? So this is the guy on the we need to divide Israel we need to divide Jerusalem right now bandwagon. Mm-hmm. He's going out and speaking to Samantha Power when she comes in. He's the one who's probably speaking to the Obama administration when they're trying to figure out what needs to happen in Jerusalem and how it needs to be pushed forward. They're listening to Danny Seidman. I know that. It's problematic because I listen to Danny Seidman and I know what he said. But when I go listen to Danny Seidman's presentation about what's going on in Jerusalem, my understanding of when I see what he's actually showing me of these hills and valleys and streets and all these things, there's no way you can divide Jerusalem right down the major highway between the Haredi neighborhoods in the north and the Arab neighborhoods in the northeast. It ain't happening. I mean, the conflict that would happen in that area is ridiculous. If we're worried about rockets going across, you could you could slingshot a crock pot across the barrier. There's no way you have peace with that as the border.
So why would somebody suggest something like that? I mean, that's so impractical.
What he believes, and I think this is where they run into a lot of interesting issues, is that he believes that if there were two states in Jerusalem, everybody would be living at peace with one another.
Except for the philosophy and the ideology undergirding the Palestinian narrative.
Then you get this argument that that Jerusalem should be a separate entity, right? That there's no way to divide it. Everybody should be together. But if it's an undivided entity, then it's a semantic game. Why would you have the UN, which can't control anything, can't secure anything anywhere in the world? There's no place in the world that the UN is pledged to secure that it actually has secured and protected civilian populations. Not a single one. In every place that the UN has tried to protect civilian populations, it has failed. So why in the world would there be a belief that that the United Nations would be able to step in and secure a united Jerusalem? There's no way it could.
Well, that harkens back to basic philosophy of idealism.
So you get this idea, but what you get this ideal about Jerusalem. So what I got from the Seidman tour of Jerusalem is that what doesn't make sense are the new settlements north of Ma'ale Adumim, east of the major blocks, and that what Israel really needs to do is maintain the ridgeline, because the ridgeline is a defensible border. It makes a lot of sense as a defensible border.
Not the green line, but the ridgeline.
Not the green line, but the ridgeline. I mean, a real border. People don't understand that the green line was simply an armistice line, and it was not a secure line. So if you're stressing security, the green line isn't even going to come up. And what I can tell you is the reality is Israelis don't prioritize Judaism or democracy at the top of their list or land. They prioritize security, because without the security, they're dead and the other things don't matter. I mean, let's get that point across. Any solution that does not have security at the top of the list isn't going to fly.
Now, of course, then the left wing basically says that the only way to have security is through justice, as they would call it.
Well, look, I think anybody who argues that the Palestinians are going to be willing to accept a solution that is bad for them, bad for their children, it doesn't understand reality. There's no way that's going to happen. The question is whether or not that is only based on land, or it could be based on something else. I mean, if you're dealing with a solution in which you want to argue that the Palestinians are not going to have security, they're not going to have prosperity, but they're going to have East Jerusalem cut off from the rest of Jerusalem, in which it'll be almost useless as far as a tourist destination, and it's going to be constantly threatened by Hamas. I think the Palestinians would say, we don't want that. We'd much rather have a situation like we have now, where it could be an issue. And we'll talk more about that when we get back from a short break.
Northern Lights Pizza's amazing garlic butter makes amazing breadsticks. Now available in 12-ounce bottles at Northern Lights, Hy-Vee, and Graziano's.
Northern Lights Pizza.
I'm Brian Leach, owner of Service Legends, and my position is Chief Talent Officer.
I'm Nicholas Wonderscheid.
I am Bernie Hobbs.
And I'm the Service Manager.
Marketing Director and Client Relations Manager.
Everything that we do is about ensuring that we exceed your expectations.
Our clients are important to us. 100% satisfaction.
We're not just focused on heating and cooling. That's the easiest part of our job, actually, is fixing furnaces and air conditioners.
Everyone that we come in touch with, we want to improve lives.
Bottom line is, we've got our installation guarantees, 25% energy savings guarantee, comfort guarantee, temperature selection guarantee, property protection guarantee.
100% satisfaction guaranteed, fixed rate or it's free.
All of those guarantees are backed up with a 100% money back guarantee to hold ourselves accountable to making sure that you get what you're after.
Just fixing the problem today. If they have another problem 5 days down the road, it's still fixed rate or it's free.
We use what's called straightforward pricing. Our technicians are going to give you an exact to-the-penny price on what it's going to take before they move forward with any repair. That way you know what to expect.
It's the same price every day.
No surprises.
If you get off work at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, you come home, you realize that, my furnace is broken. Now you need to call somebody out that night. You shouldn't have to pay more for that.
We're guaranteeing service 24/7.
We run afternoons, evenings, nights, weekends. We're staffed to work that.
Phone rings at 3 in the morning. You'll get one of our representatives answering the phone every time.
We're not sending you out to Timbuktu in some call center. It's our Service Legend team members, our mission control team.
I'll take a call anytime.
And then they answer the phones the same way during the day as they do at night.
It's a great day at your service company. How can we make you smile?
That's the only way to provide true 24-hour service.
When you're able to let somebody actually live in their home safely when they weren't able to do that before, where they don't have to stay up at night and worry about, is the heat going to come back on? Are we going to freeze the pipes? Is the baby in the room next door going to be sick because they got too cold? When you're able to help somebody overcome challenges like that, that's impacting a life. That makes a difference. I get goosebumps thinking about it.
I love the team. I love the people that I work with.
We have fun, but we work hard.
I call them my ambassadors of legendary service. If you could just envision what that is, that's who we're sending to your home.
They literally will call in, pick up the phone and call and say, hey, I want to talk to your manager. And I get on the phone, they're like, that technician that was at my house was the greatest technician ever. That's cool to me.
We want to brighten people's days.
Every person that we have going into the house has gone through an extensive background check.
Drug testing, we have a very thorough interview process that 1 out of 140 people make it through.
If we promise you something, that's what you're going to get, no matter what.
We're here when you need us to protect the safety and comfort of your family.
If you're not happy, we're going to make it right.
If we're willing to put 100% money back guarantee on what we do, what type of work do you think we do?
Give us a call. We're there for you 24/7, 365 days a year.
Enough said.
Shalom. Welcome back to the Whole Megillah with Rabbi David Kaufman and Mark Finkelstein. And we're talking more or less about the Pew poll. We keep kind of starting there and getting off.
Well, that's because it's crosshatched by politics.
There's tons of stuff. Tons of stuff it connects to. And let's go back to the poll here.
Okay.
So where we were, 97% of ultra-Orthodox and 96% of modern Orthodox Jews believe that Jews should receive preferential treatment in Israel. Now, if that includes the right of return, I could see that, right? Because the whole idea is that Jews should be able to come back to the Jewish homeland, and there's some question about that. But I don't think that that's what it means.
I don't think so either.
Beyond that.
I don't think so either. It sort of signifies that in all references between the two populations, that Jews should always have the preference. And I think the rest of us think that's not a good way to do it.
Well, and there are a number of situations in which that preference could potentially be a seriously problematic, right? I mean, you have settlers going through and uprooting crops and harassing Israeli Arabs and all kinds of other things.
Yeah, but that's
right? I mean, should they receive preferential treatment from the government for that, or setting up an outpost or on territory? Should they receive I mean, that's I think where they're going with this.
Well, that's where they're going. I think we're going in to make sure that access to education, access to food supplies are constant for everybody, and that's how it should be in a democratic country.
I agree. So that was one article on Times of Israel that dealt with this Israeli and Arab issues.
Right. Now, that was done by Pew.
It was done by Pew.
And Pew is usually a fairly good polling source.
And there were several other interesting questions on this survey and responses, right? So one of the articles was about the current reform and conservative issues in Israel. 54% of Israelis oppose letting non-Orthodox rabbis perform weddings, but secular Jews support it to the tune of 65%. 2/3 of secular Israelis believe that Reform and conservative Jews should be performing them. A significant percentage probably don't care, and a significant percentage of them, I'm sure, believe that the religion that they don't follow is Orthodox.
Right.
Orthodox opposed by 70%, which means 30% of even the Orthodox believe that Reform and conservative should be able to.
Unless they don't understand the issue.
Interesting. Now, only 5% of Israelis identify as Reform or conservative, but 41% identify as no particular stream, not necessarily non-religious.
And that's about half of the population.
So many of those could identify as Reform or conservative if there was a level playing field and they had some idea of what Reform and conservative Judaism was.
Which they don't.
We get the idea in Israel that most Israelis don't even know Reform or conservative Judaism. They're taught that Orthodox Judaism is the only Judaism, and then they find out that they don't agree with Orthodox Judaism and they become secular. And that's the problem the Israelis run into. But there's some other really problematic things here. 47% of Israelis oppose allowing women to pray aloud at the Western Wall. And only 55% of seculars support that.
Well, when these facts come across, one has to wonder whether people are responding to something other than the question is put to them.
Well, I mean, I'm sure they are, but that's still a problematic statement.
Well, of course there's a problem.
I mean, you probably do have a significant percentage of seculars who's saying, why would anybody want to pray at the Western Wall at all?
To
we're
begin
secular.
with. Right, yeah.
Why would they want to go there? But it just seems like freedom and liberty don't seem to be high on the list of concerns, right?
Or at least personal freedom.
Yeah. Well, so then you get this. Then you get the questions that really start differentiating between the non-Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox in Israel and the ultra-Orthodox in Israel, and it really shows you that there are two Israels. So 88% of secular Israelis believe in separation of religion and state. 88%.
Yes.
We have a religious ministry that controls significant aspects of Israeli life, marriage and death.
As opposed by 88% of the population.
And 88% of the population opposes that. That should tell you something. There's a big problem there.
But they have no means of addressing this.
Well, if 88% of them support that,
but
it's simply a matter of either getting rid of the institution entirely or doing something that changes
to modify it.
Right? Now, what's interesting is we had this conversation about the government supporting rabbis financially and supporting institutions financially. And the Israelis stress that they have a German model, not an American model. In other words, they believe that the government should support the religious institutions because that's a fundamental part of the country, but that the government should be supporting them all rather than supporting a select group of them because that select group is opposed by another group. So just going through some of this secular versus religious issues. So 80% of the religious population supports the connection of religion and state. 94% of secular Israelis support transportation on Shabbat, on the Sabbath.
Of course they do.
96% of the Orthodox oppose it.
Yes. Well, there's the complete difference of value there.
It doesn't get much more different than that.
Yeah.
69% of Israelis argue that a woman should be able to divorce her husband without his consent. 59% of ultra-Orthodox oppose that. What shows you what's interesting is that it's a small percentage even of the ultra-Orthodox that's holding on to the argument that shouldn't be the case. Because if you have
about
only have
40%
60% of the ultra-Orthodox who
right,
support
about
that. So 40% of the ultra-Orthodox don't even support that position.
Yeah.
Okay, so now you go to education. This is frightening for me. 53% of Israelis believe in evolution. This is a country that's leading the world per capita in Nobel Prizes.
And yes.
And guess what? They're not coming from the 47% of the population that doesn't believe in evolution.
Right.
So what that tells you is that the amazing thing about Israel is it's even more amazing than you thought. 3% of Haredi Jews, 11% of Datim, the other forms of ultra-religious, believe in evolution. That should be pretty shocking. 83% of the secular Israelis believe it. 66% of Ashkenazi Jews, German origin Jews, Eastern European Jews, believe in evolution, but only 39% of Mizrahi Jews, the Arab and African Jews.
Well, yes. Well, obviously that's cultural.
The percentage of Orthodox Jews, this is Orthodox Jews, with a college education is under 20%.
Right.
Frightening. You know, I wonder what the percentage of Jews with a college education in this country is.
With a college education? Probably
93% among all denominations. So what's going on in Israel?
Yeah. We know what's going on. The fact is you have the Cheder system, and it's traditional education stressed over making a living in the real world.
Well, and here's another interesting number. 46% of people raised modern Orthodox won't identify as Orthodox by adulthood. Half.
Right. Yeah.
That's probably a shocking number. Now, most of the people who are secular will stay secular. Most of the people who are ultra-Orthodox will stay ultra-Orthodox. It's the middle ground.
The 46%?
46% of people who identify as modern Orthodox.
Of modern. Well, where are they going to go?
They're going to secular.
Because there's no intermediary.
Now, what I would argue is some of those people are going to Reform and Conservative in Israel. And because we saw some of them in the congregations that we went to in Israel. Those are people who are showing up on Shabbat in the congregations in Israel.
Yeah.
In the Reform and Conservative congregations. Many of them. They don't like the attitudes of the Orthodox religious establishment in Israel, and they wanted to go somewhere that's more tolerant.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have some 93% of seculars oppose their children marrying ultra-Orthodox. 96% of ultra-Orthodox oppose their children marrying seculars. Forget are you marrying a Jew or not?
Right.
And the population of Arabs, Christians, and Druze, Arab Christians, Arab Muslims, and Druze in Israel, it's all over 80% that oppose intermarriage.
Oppose intermarriage. Because
all those populations oppose intermarriage.
We know the Druze prefer to marry within their own group.
So you're dealing. I mean, you're dealing with a population that is significantly divided. I mean, I would say that there are two Israels. There's Jerusalem and there's Tel Aviv. I mean, and when you look at the culture, the religion, all of that stuff, and you compare those two cities, there's nothing close to being alike. I mean, they're different worlds. You wouldn't even believe you're in the same country if it weren't for the fact that they were both speaking Hebrew.
Frankly, the only reason this makes any difference is because of the power differential given to the Orthodox.
Yeah, and so for those who don't know, the ultra-Orthodox parties, there are two ultra-Orthodox parties that control 12 votes. That's 10% of the Knesset. And right now, they're basically the deciding votes in the coalition. Benjamin Netanyahu's majority coalition has 61 seats in a Knesset of 120 seats.
Which is just the barest of majorities.
So, I mean, if he loses one vote, he loses the majority. If he loses 12 votes, you could potentially see new elections. Now, the interesting thing here is that the question is whether or not Netanyahu will call out the Arab parties and take their bluff, because right now the polls look like if there were new elections, Netanyahu wouldn't be the prime minister. You'd have a left-leaning coalition, and potentially that left-leaning coalition could even work with Likud and some of the other parties to create a secular, non-religious government. Because as you can tell, when you got 88% of the population pushing for separation of church and state, there is pretty strong
overlap.
There's
crossover.
A pretty strong push in order to put forth some of those secular agenda items in relation to the Orthodox. And so the Orthodox are taking a big risk by challenging the Netanyahu administration, particularly on this issue of the Reform and Conservative prayer space at the Western Wall Plaza. Benjamin Netanyahu's ultra-Orthodox coalition partners informed him that they will quit the government if he goes ahead and enacts any measures that would be interpreted as official state recognition of Reform and Conservative Judaism. So on Sunday, Prime Minister Netanyahu heard the threat firsthand during a meeting with the leaders of United Torah Judaism and Shas, along with Naftali Bennett of Jewish Home.
Yeah.
And the coalition rests on a razor-thin majority, as we just pointed out, essentially a one-seat majority in the House.
But in addition, that will further alienate the American Jewish community.
And the reason that this was put forward is because the American Jewish community said, look, you're running the risk of alienating an entire generation of Jews by having a setup that makes it so that Reform and Conservative Jews are devalued in Israel. And they're officially devalued. It's not just that they're unofficially devalued, they're officially devalued.
So how do you read Netanyahu on this issue?
Well, so look, the day before I came to Israel for the Central Conference of American Rabbis Conference, the Reform leadership actually had a meeting with Prime Minister Netanyahu. And so what I would say on the issue is that Netanyahu seems to be at least willing to move in that direction, seems interested. In fact, I think he's very interested in working with American Jews to make this happen because, look, the American Jewish support that he's receiving is not coming from the ultra-Orthodox. Right, the people who are the strength of AIPAC are not the ultra-Orthodox parties in Israel. The people who are going to stand up for him, certainly in any kind of a Democratic administration in the United States, and in the vast majority of Republican administrations from the Jewish community anyway, are going to be Reform and Conservative Jews. And when these people come up to you and say, our next generation of young Jews don't feel like Israel cares about them or validates them because they have policies that officially devalue them, that's a problem. And not only that, but many of those Jews are of a religious status that the Israeli rabbinic leadership wouldn't consider to be Jewish. They have parents who converted to conservative or Reform Judaism, and the Israeli rabbinate wouldn't consider their mothers to be Jewish, and therefore they're not Jewish either. And this is going to be a big crisis, I think, going forward.
Well, it's a big crisis now because it has an impact.
But it's going to be a bigger crisis going forward because what you're seeing right now, realistically, is more and more American Jews wanting to go to Israel and interact with Israel in the long term. Potentially marrying Israelis, potentially moving to Israel. And the more this issue is in question, the more problematic it's going to be. And it needs to be solved sooner rather than later. Additionally, you have a large percentage of Israelis who are sick of the domination of the Haredim. And Netanyahu, I think, is trying to find ways to deal with that without dealing with it directly. In other words, instead of saying, as a secular Israeli, I don't like you, he's going to say, I'm going to work with the Reform and conservative movements in order to make this happen. And oh, by the way, that'll please the 88% of Israelis who believe in a separation of church and state.
Now, all of this doesn't mean very much in the day-to-day relationship that we have in working with Israelis.
Well, it's because, look, as American Jews, our primary issues are going to be Jewish cultural and security, right? I mean, that's the real thing. We value Israel for the culture and the religious aspects that it brings into our lives and that we could potentially have by interacting with Israel. And we want to maintain it as a secure homeland for the Jewish people who need to flee from persecution around the world. And as we're seeing a rising anti-Semitism around the world, that becomes all the more important.
Now, just to hammer that home, the people we deal with on a regular basis from the Western Galilee, just like everybody else, we don't deal with the Haredi.
Absolutely. I mean, look, most of the people we deal with are Jews like us. Some of them are Orthodox Jews who are a little more religious than us, but for the most part, that's who we are. And we'll talk more about it as we continue on further episodes of the whole Megillah, because our time is up. Thank you. We'll see you soon.